Do you think that food itself can be addictive?
You know, yes and no. I think that if you're an addiction researcher and you understand the central nervous system impacts of engaging in either a drug addiction or a gambling addiction or any, you get it's a dopamine response that it's a very characteristic. And you get those same responses because of the pleasure of eating food. Now, does that mean it's addictive, however? I think experts are somewhat torn. And the difference is, and the part that makes it so complicated, is that you don't need to take drugs. You don't need to gamble. You don't, but you have to eat. And so separating out an addictive behavior component from an essential living component just makes it very complicated. So I tend to stay away from the label addiction, but I will acknowledge that corporations spend a lot of effort to make food as tasty as possible so that people keep coming back. And I think you can describe it like that without necessarily invoking addiction.
Hmm. Speaking of marketing and big corporations and big food in the role that they play toward our diet, what are some of the things that you've seen um, in terms of that regard?
Well, I think ultra processed foods is the number one issue, and we will talk about that later in the course. But right now, almost 60% of the calories that Americans consume is ultra processed foods, and um, and and those foods are easily overconsumed. We're going to talk about a study conducted by one of my colleagues at NIH, Kevin Hall, and what he did is he brought participants into his clinic and kept them there for a month. And for 2 weeks, he had half of them eating at a cafeteria of ultra processed foods, and the other half at a cafeteria with whole foods, made them as comparable as they could. And then after 2 weeks, they switched. And so everybody ended up eating at the ultra processed cafeteria for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, they consumed 500 calories more per day than those at the Whole Food cafeteria. And they gained weight. And
Hmm.
those at the Whole Food cafeteria lost weight. And so if 67% of our calories, 57% of our calories are coming from ultra processed foods, it's longer than 2 weeks. It's a
Hmm.
lifetime. And you can understand that we are just over consuming those foods. So that's probably the biggest issue. I think just the fact that we are surrounded by very tasty, inexpensive, easily accessible food that we eat at every occasion, whether or not we're studying or bored or watching television or socializing with our friends or stressed. Those are all occasions to eat. And if you keep a careful food log, it'll be surprising how few times you find yourself eating because you're actually hungry. And so we eat excessively. And I think that just overrides our homeostatic control of body weight and we gain weight. And so it's a structural issue in the country. There's a term um, that I use. It's kind of an old-fashioned term. It's in psychology. It's called structural violence. And structural violence describes where people are harmed because of the way the system is designed. And it relates to lots of things, everything from discrimination in housing and redlining and violence against women and all of these sorts of things where the system is designed in a way in which a certain fraction of the population is harmed. And I think the food system in the United States is exactly that we are allowing food corporations to offload their responsibilities and gain all the profits from this without any responsibility whatsoever. And so I would call that structural violence. Our taxes pay for the health care, our taxes pay for the environmental costs, and and so there'll be a reckoning. We used to think that cigarette companies were invincible. Now we think food corporations are invincible, and it'll change eventually.
Certainly. My next question was gonna be, what types of steps do we need to take in order to combat that, or essentially change that structure so it's not as violent?
Well, we need a national food policy, but we also need just more regulation. And again, people hate it when you fall back on that, but so many things are regulated. Why not food corporations? Right now, the only regulation is safety. But why? We should tax sugar. We should limit processing. We should tax foods that we know increase the risk of diabetes or weight gain or hypertension, and then take those taxes to subsidize foods that are just intrinsically more expensive. Fruits and vegetables are always going to be more expensive than commodity crops, and they're just more labile. They're more difficult to transport, and so they're going to be more expensive. And so we need to subsidize them so that people can rationalize reasonably that I can feed my family with healthy foods at a price that's cheaper than some of these other ultra-processed foods.